I'm Spencer Mazyck, and joining me now to discuss state tax issues as they relate to the False Claims Act is Jack Trachtenberg. He is counsel at Sutherland Asbill Brennan, who specializes in all things state tax related. Welcome, Jack. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Spencer. Great to be here.
So let's just begin with what is the False Claims Act and who typically files these types of lawsuits?
Sure. Well, a False Claims Act is really any kind of a law that allows an informer, some people refer to them as whistleblowers, to bring a lawsuit on behalf of the government to seek damages for some alleged wrongdoing that's been done against the government. And the unique aspect of False Claims Acts is that it allows the whistleblower, if they're successful, or if the government's successful, to get a portion of that as a reward, a portion of the damages as a reward. You know, I think it's also important for the audience to understand what a False Claims Act is not.
Okay.
You very often hear prosecutors, attorney generals, other supporters of the False Claims Act say that it's an anti-fraud statute and that people who are sued under it have committed alleged fraud.
Yes, I've heard that.
Yeah, and you know, that's sometimes very true, and it can be very important in going after fraud, but what people need to know is that the statutes often, in fact, almost always don't require a showing of an intent to defraud the government. So it actually encapsulates or captures potentially a whole host of non-fraudulent activity, and people can get caught up in these lawsuits even if they haven't committed fraud.
Oh, so tell me, Jack, though, is there a difference between a state's False Claims Act and the federal act?
Yeah, well, for the most part, the state False Claims Acts are modeled after the federal act, but there's one key difference. The federal False Claims Act has always had, has never allowed, and now has what's called a tax bar. So people who have allegedly committed some wrongdoing under the Internal Revenue Code can't be sued by private plaintiffs at the federal level under the Internal Revenue Code or the Federal False Claims Act. There are a host of states right now that don't have tax bars, or like New York, have explicitly authorized tax claims to be brought under the False Claims Act. So that's the key difference, is that there's a movement in the states to allow whistleblowers to bring lawsuits against people who have allegedly violated state tax codes.
Okay, speaking of New York, how did state tax-related matters in New York and Illinois become the subject of FCA litigation?
Sure. Well, in New York's case, it came about as a result of a law change. Back in 2010, then Senator Schneiderman, now our Attorney General, sponsored an amendment to the False Claims Act. And that amendment was to specifically authorize whistleblowers to bring False Claims Act lawsuits under New York's False Claims Act. In Illinois, the history goes back a little further, and while they don't explicitly authorize tax claims, they have only what's called a partial tax bar that says you can't bring the claims for income tax matters. And that's left open the opportunity for whistleblowers to bring actions with respect to the state's sales tax.
Are there any other state tax issues that are also the subject of FCA litigation?
Well, yeah, there's been a whole host of them. They've tended to, you know.
I figured that was a pretty broad question.
Yeah, sure. They've tended to focus on sales tax and some aspects of unclaimed property. Okay, so in New York, there's this Sprint case that's out there that
Sprint
Nextel has been sued for $300 million with respect to whether or not sales tax should have been collected on flat rate charges for wireless voice services. In Illinois, there's been a whole host of litigation about whether out-of-state retailers, your online remote vendors, were required to collect sales tax on goods sold to Illinois residents. And then in the unclaimed property area, there have been some interesting cases around whether or not unused minutes on prepaid calling cards were unclaimed property that should have been remitted to the state. Life insurance companies have been sued with respect to unclaimed life insurance proceeds that were not turned over to the state. So it's really encapsulated a bunch of things, mostly sales tax, unclaimed property. A lot of people think the states at some point will move into areas like corporate income tax as well.
So what are some basic differences in procedures and penalties between normal tax disputes and lawsuits filed under the False Claims Act?
Yeah, there's a huge difference. You know, every state varies, but when you're talking about what I'll call a routine civil administrative audit, tax audit.
It sounds interesting.
So yeah, nothing's routine about it, but you know, most states have very well-defined, well-established procedures for administratively resolving tax disputes in a cost-effective or a more cost-effective and efficient manner. There's opportunities to resolve the case with the state's auditors. There's opportunities to go sometimes to informal mediation or conciliation conferences to resolve the matter. And there's even sometimes special tax courts with judges who understand the tax law, you know, less formal rules of evidence. So it can be a more efficient, cost-effective process for the taxpayer. When you get into the False Claims Act area, it's a whole different ballgame, because now you're dealing with litigation in state court, it tends to be much more burdensome in terms of discovery. It's more burdensome in terms of the evidentiary standards. It can be much more costly. And then the other aspect is that you're talking about a public proceeding. Whereas in the administrative realm, in a sort of routine civil audit, in most states and in most cases, the taxpayer is protected by confidentiality so that their tax business is not known to the world.
And those sound like some drawbacks, but do lawsuits, though, filed under the False Claims Act, give states more leverage in reaching settlements?
I think the answer to that has to be yes. I mean, number one, the damages under the False Claims Act can be 3 times the amount of the tax allegedly owed. Okay, so in a routine, I keep calling it routine, in a normal civil proceeding, an administrative proceeding, you're talking about, do I just owe the tax? In a False Claims Act lawsuit, the potential downside is 3 times the tax plus penalties, statutory penalties. The other aspect is that almost always when someone is sued under the False Claims Act and the Attorney General decides to prosecute that case, there's usually all sorts of bad publicity that calls the taxpayer a fraud and a cheat. Even though it's not necessarily an anti-fraud statute, it doesn't require showing a fraud. You look at the Sprint example and what was put in the papers, they were called tax cheats and frauds. So there's reputational risks. And then the last thing is confidentiality. I mean, a lot of taxpayers, individuals, and businesses are concerned about having their tax return filings and things related to their tax returns disclosed. And that's why we have confidentiality in the administrative realm, so that taxpayers feel free to cooperate with the states, give them the information they need to do their audits, and resolve the problem.
So, Jack, from a policy perspective, is the False Claims Act, whether state or federal, an effective tool in enforcing tax laws?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. I think it has the ability to be very effective when you're dealing with real fraud. There's oftentimes that the state enforcers don't have access to inside information. And I think it can be used positively there, where insiders can bring forward evidence of real wrongdoing. I think the real concerns have to do with non-fraud cases that I believe should be handled by the taxing authorities. So one of the downsides is that, by putting the case into the hands of the Attorney General, you're having tax policy and tax administration decisions taken out of the hands of the experts, the revenue authorities, and put into the hands of an Attorney General, who very often, by the way, is an elected official, and may not necessarily be driven entirely by good tax policy, but by other political considerations. That's one downside and one concern. I think the confidentiality or lack of confidentiality in the False Claims Act is a concern for the reasons I said. It may cause taxpayers who are under audit to not want to have a chilling effect on their willingness to cooperate with auditors. You think about the Sprint case and you read the complaint that the Attorney General filed, and if you read between the lines, it seems pretty clear that Sprint's case was originally before the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. Then it got kicked over to the AG. Well, if taxpayers realize that their case before the tax department could suddenly become a False Claims Act case, are they going to be as willing to cooperate with the taxing authorities, which makes the taxing authorities' job more difficult? And I think the last thing I would note, especially with respect to sales tax, is if there's this pressure because of the False Claims Act and the fear of treble damages and the fear of the adverse publicity and the fear of a judicial proceeding, and companies just sort of decide to be overly conservative and err on the side of caution and just collect the sales tax. It's nothing out of their pocket. I'll collect it and turn it over to the state. Then on the flip side, what we see happening is that companies and businesses become subject to class action lawsuits by citizens who are saying, you illegally collected the tax from me and you owe us damages. So it's a catch-22 for many of these companies.
All right. Well, I certainly learned a lot today. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
For more information on this or other topics, subscribe to BloombergLaw.com. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody.
Did I go okay?